Okay, I'll turn that off too. And the sound.
Oh, great.
Hey, Brian, we're waiting a couple seconds. Where's that Angie?
How was your reunion on Sunday?
It was good. It was a lot of fun.
That's good.
Yeah, it was actually on Saturday.
On Saturday.
Yeah. Another friend of ours didn't leave until Friday, so he got in Friday late. But it was very nice. There was much laughter. And the trading of stories that grow better every year because there's always new details that just...
Oh,
yeah.
That's always good.
All right, I am going to get started. I don't know if Sherry and Steve are going to show up or not. Got a lot of pressure on you, Marcia.
I know.
So I'm going to do a little bit first on some research that has informed what I was trying to do. And the first one comes with the idea that this is a historical writing. And in modern Western ideas, historical writing is something that we think, especially if it's a scholarly thing, we think that it's supposed to capture the events, as they really were. These objective accounts of past events. The truth is that idea didn't even come into being until the 19th century at European universities. So prior to that, historical writings had one of two purposes, and it depended on who was doing the writing. So if it was somebody who was outside of the court, it was the whole intention was to teach some kind of lesson. Either to teach the readers how to be good citizens, how to live proper religious lives, or how to behave morally right. If the writer was doing this while he was a member of the court, then it was what's called an apologetic, and it was just basically a justification for all of the actions of the king, kind of showing how the king basically did everything as a matter of fulfilling his royal duties. The problem we have with 1 Samuel is there's an extensive argument about who actually wrote it. Was it a person or a series of people who were involved in the court? Or was it people who were close enough that they knew people in the court, but they were outside of it? So again, we're kind of left with, how do we approach this? Is this all an apologetic? Is this kind of some justification for the way things went? Or is this some kind of moral lesson? Another thing that I actually considered a couple weeks ago was that some of the Psalms were written during this time. In fact, there are Psalm 59 is a reference to Saul's attempt on David's life. Hello.
Hi.
Psalm 34 has references to acting insane like David did when he first went to Philistia. Psalms 57 and 142 reference David living in the caves. Psalm 52 references our favorite Edomite, Dog. So, and Psalms take historical traditions, they put them into a solid framework, and then they give them theological meaning through the psalm itself. So does that mean we should have been looking at the psalms associated with these at the same time? Or should they inform it? Because there are a lot of them, and I didn't get to them. I mean, this was, let's see, Psalm 59, 11, 34, 56, 57, 142, 7, 52, 17, and 54 were just from the first source that I found. And the second one I found had 3 pages listed. And I'm like, I'm done with this. Obviously, I need to look closer later.
So those are all, sorry, we came in late, Psalms that are associated with
With the
Samuel.
First Samuel. Yeah, yep. So, of course, there are more that are associated with Second Samuel because 73 of the 150 Psalms are attributed to David. So, also, you missed the fact that historical writings, our idea of historical writings is that they should be somehow be objective, sticking to the facts. That whole idea with historical writings didn't show up until 19th century at European universities. So prior to that, they had one of 2 jobs. The first was either to teach some kind of moral lesson, like how to be a good citizen or how to live a proper religious life or to make good moral choices. And the other was if the person who wrote them was actually in the court at the time, it was kind of an argument for how the king made all of his decisions and kept to his kingly duties. So all of these actions that the king took were all completely in line with this guy being king, but because we're not sure if the writer or writers were in the court or near the court or just later writers, we don't know which one we should approach it as. We all saw that there were multiple stories associated with historical events, like David entering Saul's court as the lyre player who soothes the king, and then suddenly the king doesn't know who David is, and he comes and kills Goliath. And so the argument made here is that all of these stories and traditions just kind of get told and reworked over time, and then they got put in the Bible because they were trying to substantiate a particular picture of who God is. Problem with that one? God really doesn't show up a lot in here. He plays a pretty marginal role, popping up now and again to make pronouncements, but then you don't see much. So then you're kind of left with, well, we have people at center stage, and another argument was, well, basically what you're watching is the people who are the main characters of this, basically living the lot that they have been handed based on the decisions that they've made. Another argument was that the prophets, so in this one it would be Samuel, are somehow themselves presented to the readers as the vehicles of religious and political perspectives. And usually they're set countercultural. So if you read Isaiah, everything that Isaiah argues for is for a change in the way that the culture is going. Jeremiah does that too. You can see that a little bit in Samuel too, when everybody's like, give us a king, and he's like, you're not supposed to have one. So we can is it somehow helpful to get an idea of what was going on religiously and politically at the time? another thing that was said actually frequently that did not help was that because this is not a historical book in the way that we usually expect them to be, that it's supposed to be read as a literary work of art, that you take each story as you come across it individually, but that because you should read it this way, it's you can see that it's meant to be this because it has particular strengths in dramatic force and human appeal. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I understand the idea of appeal because we all kind of like that. Clearly, we all kind of like watching the political game because it's the biggest show in town. But is that the appeal? That's the human appeal in this? I don't know.
Well, I mean, and you were like, oh, it's like a soap opera.
It is.
So, I mean, so there you go, sort of like that, like human appeal type thing.
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where we always have to be aware that while we can try to step aside as much as we can from our own existences and lives and experiences, you can only go so far. You're always going to interpret in some way, shape, or form the events of these stories from your own experiences and how you relate to them. That's just kind of the way the human brain works, is creating relationships and associations. So as I'm struggling with all this, it basically came down to this book and the stories in it has some kind of goal. And it's not objective historical accuracy. So is it teaching us a moral lesson? Does it justify the king's actions? Or does it illustrate particular perspectives about the relationship between God and Israel? Or is it trying to paint a particular picture of God? It's kind of, where I was left hanging, and I don't have answers. Honestly, I have more questions than I have answers at this point. Part of it, I think, is because we didn't go through 2 Samuel.
So you can,
I have half the story, and it's all one book anyway. It's just divided because it was 2 scrolls because it was so long. So, and even on that thing, do they serve a purpose that's non-theological, and then the Psalms throw in theological meaning for us? I don't know. That's driving me crazy. I love it. So I thought what we would discuss is some of these questions that I have, maybe what your thoughts on them are, and they're just based on all the commentaries and research and things like that. And just kind of see if you got anything out of it based on these questions. If I miss anything and you want to throw something in, that's great, because I'll be chasing this for a long time. There are many rabbit holes, and I will follow them all. It's my special gift. So let's start with the idea that some kind of picture of God is being presented here. What picture of God do you think they're trying to get across?
punishes those that aren't faithful.
I mean, that seems reasonable, right? Once you're disobedient, you're out. Seems kind of fickle, doesn't he? I mean, it's like, I'm done with Saul. What?
But I mean, one, it was in particular to, I mean, part of it, was in particular to his house or his, like, not really, you know, you didn't punish people for doing like wrong to their neighbor, but punish that, you know, for doing wrong when it was related to him.
To him, okay,
You
yeah,
know, like
yeah.
bringing up offerings, and then the sons were, you know,
Right.
doing something wrong with that, or, you know.
So it's like when you do an affront to me, you're done. Do something to somebody else, I can see that. I had something and now it's gone from my head. I'll get it
You
back.
know, I mean, he did allow people to make their own mistakes. That was fine.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going. Thank you for reminding me, because it was kind of like there's not a lot of intervention. You live the results of your choices. I'll step in at certain times, but the rest of the time you act and you have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah. Like, you want a king? All right.
Yeah,
I'll give you a king.
fine, but you got to deal with everything you're going to get with a king, and here's all it is. I'm gonna list it off for you. But even that, it was like Saul's actions. It wasn't until it was an affront to God or something. How many people did he kill? He killed all those priests, or had them killed.
So all they did was kill.
Yeah, it is.
What did they do with the bodies?
Usually there was a truce at the end of a battle, in which everybody would go claim their dead. So either that or they went full on outlaw Josie Wales. Buzzards got to eat, same as the worms.
Okay. They burned?
Well, some they did, clearly. Because it was right there, wasn't it? Yeah, they took Samuel and Jonathan's and the other son's bodies off the wall and burned them. So,
Well, in wars throughout time, that's one way that they disposed of the bodies was
throw them into a pit and burn them. Yeah.
even up until, I don't know if they did, but Vietnam and, World War II, one,
Yep.
blah, blah, blah.
World War One, especially because of all the disease that was associated.
Right, I mean,
Yeah.
Into a big pit.
Yep.
That way you don't have the disease and much smell for a long time.
Well, and then there's flies and rats and lice and all other insects that come along to help.
So my picture of these people, they were dirt balls.
Oh, they probably were. Yeah. I mean, they had no sense of cleanliness like we do. Absolutely not.
So I mean, they you came across the river or whatever, and that's when you bathed.
Yeah. I had my high school history teacher, Mr. Conrad, had this great bit. He says, if you ever think that you'd like to go back in like King Arthur times or any medieval times, you're going to marry the fair princess or anything like that, let me remind you, they didn't have deodorant. They didn't take baths, but maybe once a week, if you're lucky, once a month, most likely. No razors, so she had hairy legs and hairy armpits. No toothbrushes, so she probably had no teeth. So there's your fairy tale princess, boys. All right, so let's move on to the next question, which is, and I actually have sub-questions for this question. So, what is revealed about the nature of the relationship between God and Israel?
He's still their God. And like we said last time, he's letting them mess up.
Mm-hmm. But does come to the rescue.
Right. Yeah.
He was appointing judges before it. So, is this really so different from appointing a judge to appoint a king? Except for duration, right? I can never ever turn off all the sounds.
So the Israelites were fighting the Philistines.
Everybody. They were fighting everybody.
Okay, so the
The Philistines,
Philippines. So did they believe in God?
they believed in their own, yes.
Their own
Dagon.
God other than
Yep,
this guy.
yep, Dagon. Remember they took the ark when they beat Israel and they took it to the temple of Dagon and the statue kept falling over? And even the Philistines were kind of invaders. They came from the Mediterranean, from around Greece. So everybody that was already there is fighting against Israel, and then the Philistines come along. So it's everybody against everybody. One of my sub questions was: are the relationships between God and Samuel and God and Saul and God and David somehow metaphors for the for God's relationship with Israel? I mean, you get things like, Eli and Samuel and later David, who are all considered faithful people, have unfaithful children. We haven't gotten to it with David yet, but he will. While Saul's children, ironically, are the ones who are faithful. And so is it talking about how it just seems to be, there's always these generational fluxes? Like things get too good, and so we're just going to take advantage of it? The kids just take advantage of it? Or what? This kind of pendulum swing? There's lots of images of Jacob and the Exodus that pop up with David. So is he is his journey like a metaphor for the journey of Israel from Jacob all the way through the Exodus? And then the corresponding crash when his sons take over?
Samuel and Saul would be metaphors how of what else, of any thoughts?
For me, I think it would because Samuel is also technically a judge.
Right.
It would be like that relationship you saw between God and Israel all the way through Judges, which was that whole, God saved us, yay, and then they're faithful for a little while, and then they stop being. And then whenever things got really bad, they cried out to God. God sends another person, another judge, saves them. Yay, we're all in favor of God again. So I'm wondering if that's kind of... Yeah, and Saul is just that kind of, we're doing whatever we want. So it kind of makes sense that Saul would be that middle ground, the first king, because it's now all of a sudden you have the people crying out, we want to make our own decision in this matter, instead of having judges just pop up and us crossing our fingers for them. We want somebody who's in charge. Saul seems to act that way. Doesn't really consult God much, just kind of makes his own plans. Or even when he does it help? I do feel kind of bad for him at times. I mean, he made some bad decisions. He went off the deep end, especially at the end. But I don't think that he was insincere in his efforts in the beginning. And how long can you put up with that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, parts of it, like you said, you feel sorry for him. Like, you know, it's like God's not talking to me. What am I, you know?
Yeah, I'm asking.
Right.
And Samuel's like, tough luck. Isn't this your job? So is Samuel, you know, being petty in his own way.
Right. Still back to why you need a king.
Yeah. When you can have me. Like they didn't know as kids, right? I also wondered if there's a word of caution in there about interpreting God's word. Because, you know, Samuel seems more than willing and happy to editorialize and alter things along the way. The one example that I can think of, and I think of this in the context especially of David, is when Saul is supposed to kill everybody and everything, and he doesn't. And God says, I've turned back from Saul. And then Samuel confronts him and asks him for forgiveness and asks to do an offering of repentance. And Samuel just shuts him down and says, no, I'm not doing it. Would God have accepted it? He certainly accepts it from David after Bathsheba and many other things that will happen. Why not? Why wouldn't he have accepted it from Saul? And would God have? And Samuel just decided, I'm not even going to give you the opportunity. So is he making decisions on behalf of God? Meanwhile, you know, if we remember that offering moment that he was supposed to wait for Samuel, but Samuel was a day late. And so, you know, Saul seems to have thought the important message about this was making the offering, not in the waiting. So, I mean, can you blame him? Which one was more important? I mean, we kind of get later on the whole, you know, the obedience is the important thing. But he even doesn't get that until Samuel says you're done. It's too late. Now that I think about it, twice, David's men say to him, God has delivered Saul into your hands. But David doesn't interpret it that way. You know, does he have some kind of insight that others don't? It does say that he's a man after God's own heart. And the heart is the place of discernment and judgment. So, see, I told you I had more questions than answers. Just all right. So if the prophet is the vehicle for religious and political perspectives, what is Samuel revealing to us about the perspectives of his time?
do you go back to the obedience thing? No?
No, I
Do
think
you see that as a
that's definitely
religious
one
or
thing
a
when
political perspective? I mean,
the religious perspective is definitely obedience to the word of God. I mean, that's what creates the end of Saul. It's the beginning of the end for Saul when he doesn't fully obey the word of God. So that's definitely in there as a religious perspective that's going on at the time. It seems to be something that's in question because in chapter 8, Samuel also brings it up. I think he actually says the word when also. He warns them. It wasn't an 8. When I was just when I was flipping through, I saw that. In chapter 12, this is I think after Saul's first victory that rescued the people of Jerubbaal, was it? Yes, yeah. And he says that if you fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and rebel not against the Lord's words, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, he will rescue you. But if you heed not the voice of the Lord and rebel against the Lord's words, the hand of the Lord will be against you and against your king to destroy you. Which will, of course, be exactly what Saul and Saul's soldiers did in chapter 15 when they took the best of the cows and the sheep and all that kind of stuff from the Amalekites.
and I don't know whether you call sort of this like the political part of it, but it almost, I mean, it was like the rising of the Israelites, towards the end of the book,
Mhm.
they had taken over everything again.
Yeah,
So,
especially under David.
right.
Yep. So so you have the rise of political, because David's going to actually, in the end, conquer everything that was promised to Jacob. And there's a description of from this river to this river, and from this border to this border, and David's actually going to take all of it and a little more. So you do have the rise of the at least the military might of Israel. You have a little bit of on the political side, the shifting from a theocracy to a monarchy, where God is king, and now we have a person who's king. And Samuel actually just hates that, clearly. There certainly seems to be, now that I read that, going back to that thing from chapter 12, that begins with, if you fear the Lord and serve him. Well, there's certainly a transition in here somewhere where they stop fearing the Lord and start fearing Saul, who himself always seems to be afraid.
Right.
Because how many people turn, David's location in? Because they're afraid of what Saul's going to do to him.
So when does Jesus show up?
Oh,
New Testament.
a couple thousand years later.
And all that.
Yep.
Okay, so all these writings and everything is based around Israel, Egypt.
Yep.
What was going on in the rest of the planet?
Oh, you'd have to ask archaeologists that. Rome eventually takes over. Greece takes over. You have the rise of Babylon. This was finalized when Babylon took over, when they were in the midst of the Babylonian exile. Babylon gets defeated by the Persians. Persia, when the king of Persia dies, he splits up the Persian kingdom into 3 different kingdoms, which makes them weak, which is how Rome is able to come in and take over.
So when the Mayans and them
Oh, that's about the same time. All that's going on. Yeah.
about the same time?
Yeah.
So their whole, they didn't have God.
They had gods.
gods.
Yeah.
They were more into the
Well, you Quetzal, the astronomy and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did some pretty impressive stuff, especially for the time. But they had gods. Quetzalcoatl was one of them, the pale god. And when Cortez came, they thought it was him. They thought it was Quetzalcoatl because he was paler than them. But yeah, even the Mayans are fighting with Aztecs and Inca for territory. Building pyramids. Yeah, are you arguing for alien intervention?
No, I just. So. All these other things, they didn't have these writers and.
Well,
stuff that.
A lot of the civilizations did. It's whether or not they, wrote them in a way that could be preserved. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Library of Alexandria. It was the largest library in the world. It had multiple copies of all of what people then considered the important works, burned down. Did they keep them in other places? No, we got the Library of Alexandria. So, you've seen what happened even in this one, where when they talk about how old Saul was when he took over, it was a scribal error that says he was 1 when he became king. So you get some preservation issues and things like that all the time.
Well, and I'm sure, I don't know, like other religions, have their books
Mhm.
and they're
Yep.
old, like have old stories in them as well.
Absolutely.
So it's not just Israel or Judaism
Right,
or
right.
Christian.
The Bible and all the teachings and that probably even Muslims and them believe in.
Well, yeah, Allah is God.
Right.
It's they just believe that the lineage went through. It didn't go through Isaac, Abraham's son. They think it went through. Oh, how can I forget his name? I am drawing a complete blank on his name. It is exactly.
So between the Old Testament and then the New Testament, that pretty much set the norm for, because Christianity is by far
Ishmael.
the most followed or whatever religion in the world.
Yes. Christianity as a whole, yes.
As a whole, you got Catholics, you got blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But as a whole, these writings kind of took precedent over everything
Yeah.
else
Yeah.
that was ever recorded.
Well, yeah, especially when you get to the Middle Ages and things like that. Absolutely. Because the church stepped in and decided that anything that, taught something else that what the church didn't concur with, they burned it. They found a copy of it they could, and they burned it.
Kind of like Dr. Seuss.
A little. A little bit. All right, so let's ask one of the other questions people say you should ask. So, if it's a literary art and it excels in dramatic force and human appeal, what's the dramatic force? What created the most tension?
Territory, land.
Okay, so that created the most tension with people around them,
Their territory.
Yep.
Their,
or losing of it, because other people are encroaching and killing Israelites. Yeah.
well, I mean, all these battles and wars are over. Here.
So life and death? Would you say life and death is the dramatic force?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Taking over.
Taking over? Interpersonal rivalries? I mean, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
So to them back then, I know in here, there was like Saul, David, or his army killed tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Or hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Well, those aren't the actual numbers that we
No.
correlate today with 1,000 to them could have been.
I think the numbers just serve as a purpose of scale. Israel had what they thought was a lot, but when they squared up against the Philistines, clearly they didn't have a lot.
When you read all this and stuff, there's a whole lot of people dying.
Yeah, which is absolutely impossible based on even,
So you got to have new generation.
hmm
So with the young and the women and that, they were behind all this
Yeah,
fighting and stuff. Right.
yeah. There was usually a place outside of certain locations that was chosen as the battleground.
And then in this one here, I can't remember which one that went in and slaughtered the women and children.
Yeah, that was actually in Philistia. They didn't slaughter them; they captured them and dragged them away. Or are you thinking of the Amalekites?
I think of the Amalekites, I think.
Yeah, when Saul was told to go in and kill the women and the children and the cows. And yeah.
But he didn't.
But he didn't, which was going to come back and bite him in the butt. But yeah, but none of these towns were as huge as people think. You know, Jerusalem didn't even exist. The largest city in the world for that, you know, that time period up through Christ was Rome, and it might have had 1 million people, which is a lot, especially for back then, especially when you start thinking about sewage issues. But that was never matched again until London in the late Middle Ages.
Yeah, I don't know. Like the drama just seems to be about sort of the king part of it, you know, too.
Mhm.
You know, and just what.
Or who should be in charge? Because Samuel's not a king, but he certainly wants to be in charge.
Right.
Yeah. And whose dynasty takes over, and
Right.
yeah, the political intrigue is definitely a dramatic drive in this. So, what's the human appeal?
The human appeal seems like is constant death.
Only the strong survive.
Only the strong survive?
Oh, no. If you listen to God, you live. You.
Everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
In this life or that.
Right. Although back then, no. Back then, the afterlife was just
Right.
the land of the dead. No more interaction in the world of the living.
So when did the writings of heaven and
Those didn't start coming along until what's called the intertestamental period. So this was mid to late 500s BC, 567, somewhere around there. So you have that many years between when this book was finalized, canonized, and when Christ came along.
I'm jumping all over.
No, that's okay. Well, it's good to bring up, because what's the human appeal here if you have no idea of an afterlife, or the afterlife is just, you know, the same for everybody?
Like a gnat hitting the windshield.
Oh no, you still existed. You know, you just existed in the underworld or the pit or the land of the dead, just not in this world anymore.
Oh, okay.
And it's basically blah. You know, there's no food, there's no water, you don't need it. There's just nothing to bring joy, nothing even to bring anger. It was just a constant state of blah.
So then they came along and go, oh, let's sugar this up a little bit.
Could
There's
be.
streets of gold and blah blah blah. And if you live righteously and stuff, you'll go to heaven, and this is your reward.
Yep.
And if you don't, you go to hell.
Where there's the wailing and the gnashing of teeth. If you think about the idea of streets of gold, is actually kind of a deep image, because it's one of those things that everybody's always fighting over throughout history, was gold.
Right. And all wars.
Yeah, or fought over some resource.
Right. Were economics.
Yeah. And so when gold is so common that you pave the roads with it, why would you fight over it? But if you know,
And who decided?
oh, lots of people.
No, I mean like they talk about prophets and that. What, some guy decides, hey, I'm a prophet.
Oh, no, no, no. Most of the time when you read the prophets, they're like, no, thank you. It never ends well for the prophets. I mean, Isaiah stepped up, but he was very hesitant at first. Moses gave 5 excuses for crying out loud. He's like, first of all, I don't talk good. Second of all, what? Third, how do you think I'm going to get this done? Fourth, you want me to do what alone? You know, he gives these 5 excuses right off the bat. And God's like, who made the mouth? Who made the tongue? Who made human beings? He basically has to chew them out and say, do what I said. No, prophets, their lives never ended well.
How about the judges? They were appointed by the king?
No, judges were kind of called by God, but once, like, the particular enemy was defeated, they just kind of went on and lived their lives, with the exception of Samson, who died along with the Philistines that he killed. They became commoners again. Interestingly enough, the Sadducees was the one group back around Jesus' time that believed in reincarnation. But it was a reward for living a good life. You got a second trip. You did a good job. You can go on the ride again.
So when did God stop talking to all these people?
Well, it depends on who you ask. But the tradition, and the Jewish tradition, which is why, you know, there's a whole lot of dissent about whether Jesus is even a prophet, is that with the destruction of the Second Temple, the 8 days of the prophets ended. So, since the temple was destroyed, there couldn't be a prophet. All right, so let's go with one of the other ones. Is there a moral to this tale so far?
Don't appoint a schizophrenic king.
A paranoid schizophrenic, thank you very much. Which I think is funny, because then you have the next question I've written down to this is, how do the situations of these people feel similar or different from our own? Because you got to admit, there's a lot that feels
I was
familiar.
always freaking out.
Yeah. Just off his rocker at the end, especially. Would not step down. I mean, it was years he was going after David. I mean, there's that time. It was right after Samuel said, "You're done," and then Samuel goes and anoints David. And basically, the way the story goes, it seems to be the incidents happen at the same time. So the Spirit of the Lord grips David, and the Spirit of the Lord turns away from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord struck terror in him. So it's almost like the events that led to his, and Samuel saw and Samuel saw Saul no more until his dying day. As though that moment was just kind of created a psychological break in Saul that made him do these things.
Seemed to be a lot of fear, man. Fear.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that having that, the evil spirit from the Lord that struck terror in Saul makes sense that every time you see Saul about ready for battle, he's terrified.
Well, yeah, I mean, the part where, the troops were going to a frenzy.
Yeah. Like, are you talking about battle frenzy?
Yeah, yeah. Where did I read that? So every able male at that time, you're one of my troops.
But yeah, they could be. That was one of the warnings that Samuel gave. If you appoint a king, this is something he's going to conscript your sons into battle. And take some of your horses too, so they can have a cavalry.
Just seems to me that a lot of chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I mean, think like similar to now, there's power struggles and people on both sides
Mhm.
and
Constant fighting somewhere.
saying things about the other people. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, our fighting isn't wars and killing people.
Well, it is too. It is sometimes.
Yeah.
But we haven't had a person like Jones.
Oh, like the Kool-Aid guy?
Yeah, I mean we haven't had a person that say they're the prophet.
Oh, right. Oh, well, who was the guy down in Waco?
Yeah, they had the
David Koresh.
David Fresh. He was one, but that's kind of, I mean, since him, there really hasn't been any
That we know of.
wacko that's come out and
Oh, I can think of a few.
said that God has spoken to they are the prophet.
Who was the one? Was it Oral Roberts? Who went on TV and said, God told me if you don't give me
What?
$8 million, he's going to kill me? We got him. I think there's actually a denomination out there that has, I think, because I've heard people call themselves, they don't call themselves pastor or reverend, they call themselves the prophet so-and-so. So, yeah. Well, part of me wonders if also, we weren't given a hint in chapter 2 with Hannah's song, where she says, "There's no one holy like the Lord, no one beside you, no bastion," which is a military fortress like our God. "Do not go on talking high and mighty, arrogance slips from your mouth." That certainly happened all the time in here. For God is all knowing. For God all knowing is the Lord, and His is the measure of actions. Which is a great transition to the next one, which says, since people are center stage and God just occasionally pops in, and their lot is determined by their conduct. Does this hold true? All those reversal of fortunes are, listed in that song. You can see a lot of them in here.
Right.
The warrior's bow is shattered, while stumblers gird up strength. Remember David's army stumbling around? He had to leave some behind to watch the gear. They were so exhausted. What's that?
They hadn't eaten.
Yeah. Oh, well, that too. Yeah.
Who fasts before?
There are lots of superstitions associated with lots of things. Sports are crazy with them. How many times have you seen somebody say, "I'm not shaving until we lose," or something? What? Bull Durham, you ever seen that movie? Where he's was a nuke, was in a winning streak and refused to have relations with the heroine or whatever. And she's like, "That has nothing to do with it." He goes, "You know it has everything to do with it, because if you think it does, it does." The question I had for that people's lots in this story are determined by their conduct are actually twofold. First of all, poor Michal, Saul's daughter, loves David, is promised to David, is taken away from him, sent off with Peltiel or someone like that. I can't remember his name. Do her actions, is her lot determined by her conduct? And even with Samuel, even with Saul, is his lot determined by his conduct up to the point where he doesn't kill everybody that he's supposed to kill? How many times did he ask for help and for information and not get it from either God or Samuel? Even to the point where he says, "I repent, turn back with me now, let's do the offering." Samuel says no. Is denying him the right to repent a consequence of his own actions? I think the side players in this would argue a whole lot that their conduct had nothing to do with their fate.
Yeah, I mean, you do sort of feel bad for Saul sometimes.
Sometimes. After he snapped, not so much.
Right.
But, you know, he was just as surprised as everybody that Samuel anointed him.
Right.
Probably didn't even want it because he hid in the gear.
And as, and as you said, he didn't really seem like the sharpest tool in the shed either. So then here you're having.
Can't find his dad's donkeys right from the beginning.
You sort of got that issue. And
Yeah,
so probably doesn't have a lot of confidence,
yeah,
and
and is getting no support.
Right.
I mean,
David should have been the king.
well, and then again, we are left asking, okay, Samuel, you anointed him in secret. Why didn't you bring him forth, ever? So that the people could hear you say, this is the one who God has chosen now. Saul's out. I mean, how many times could Samuel have resolved the situation? But he goes away.
Well, David seemed fairly intelligent and logical, and
He certainly knew when to speak and when not to, didn't he?
right, and he had
And how to duck.
he had Saul trying to kill him half the time,
And had an opportunity to kill Saul, but didn't, and asked him, what did I do? Yeah. But again, all of this happened after Saul snapped.
Yeah. Before that, God wasn't talking to Saul. He was just, what am I supposed to be doing here? I'm king. Yes, just whatever the people tell me.
Yeah, and then when he does that, Samuel comes and chews him out for doing that. Even though Samuel did the exact same thing when the people said, we would like to have a king. And God says, oh, do what the people ask. So, but when Saul does it, that's unacceptable. Samuel seems to be the only one who escapes the consequences of his actions in all this.
Maybe that's why that book's named Samuel.
Maybe.
pretty heavy.
It is. And it's only half over. This is intermission technically for the book.
So you said, Samuel escaped consequences of his actions. But if what we think was true about Samuel, about actually wanting to be king, or like why, maybe just having to live with not.
Oh, just living his life out in a small town was the consequences of his actions?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Not I mean, because that had to be a bummer for him.
Well, I'm sure, yeah, I'm sure it was.
You know, like a jab to his ego. You know.
Yep.
So then, of course, whenever he's called upon, he's a jerk about it.
Oh, sure. Now you want me.
Right.
I can see that. So, maybe, yeah, I can see that. Just kind of dying in obscurity is the consequence of his actions. Which, again, you can ask yourself, why didn't you raise your sons better? Why? I mean, maybe he would have been more persuasive if his sons hadn't been like Eli's sons. If they know, oh, hey, yeah, there are decent guys coming up behind him. So, I mean, yeah, maybe that's fair. I can see that. Yeah, it wasn't really until even the end, the week before last, when I was starting to see repeated patterns and things like that too. But even that, will that show up in the second half?
You're gonna have to wait until next year.
I don't know.
I know you won't be able to wait that long.
Oh no, I'll be doing this starting tomorrow. At least, digging into the Psalms that are all associated with it, so I can.
So what is your readings in the Old Testament versus the New Testament, or which is easier to comprehend or decipher or understand the writings?
So,
It's a mixed bag.
like a card.
I mean, the Old Testament is hard because
I'll just write thank you.
it's
And then
so long ago and so foreign of a culture and really
You won't be.
Because you said, from like the time of Saul, that was a couple thousand years before
yeah.
Christ came in the New Testament,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
a few more
people
songs.
had to get
What?
smarter or
They wanted us to
more
do.
Or learn to write on paper.
prolific or
Yes, yeah. I mean, Rome came along and built roads, which allowed quicker travel between places and allowed the word to spread farther, faster. Jesus had 500 years of predecessors to study their understanding, and so when he presents an interpretation of an Old Testament text, you can actually find evidence of it from different rabbis that preceded him. So it's, and we just know more about the first century because more was written, more was preserved. Rome did an excellent job of record keeping. It was absurd. It's absurd how many records they have found that are just bills of sale for stuff from the marketplace. But you don't get that from back in Saul's day.
no, everything was disposable,
Yeah.
disposed.
Yeah, in fact, there's some evidence that even the Gospels that were passing around from person to person, that they were so prolific that eventually people just started wrapping. I mean, some of literally old pages of early Gospel writings have been found wrapping fish in a market in modern time because they don't throw anything away, and it's just that they had no idea what that.
These people, like in the Old Testament back in this where we're at, and that they were very nomadic people. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there was, you get overrun or whatever, you're moving out.
Yeah.
You're going someplace else to find.
And you had to find food, you had to find water, and you had to find it now. Because you didn't have running water and things like that. I mean, even when people think about how brutal the request that God made to kill every living thing, you know, that was a common thing back then. And how do you? I mean, it'd be like the best example I can think of, but it actually goes in reverse. Is to have God suddenly pop in and tell every Christian church in the nation, get that altar ready because I'm taking sacrificial offerings again. We wouldn't do it. We would not even understand the request right now. So if God were to try to present something that we understand back then, it would go nowhere.
Bringing cheesecakes, weren't you?
Tell people back then what a cheesecake is.
Right. Let me see, I made good. Oh, raising cookies.
cut the
Oh, some
cheese,
fudge.
There you go, right? What's that?
Somebody cut the cheese, right?
Yeah, plenty of times. But these are, you know, how do you can only, I mean, God only deals with us within our own context and can't it could present us with something that might be futuristic. I mean, look at how many people are still talking and trying to figure out, like, the book of Revelation. So, what do you mean wormwood's falling from the sky and is going to poison a third of the Earth's waters? Well, what's wormwood? I mean, well, yeah, back then it was a poisonous wood, but falling from the sky?
So you have Wendy Wheeler coming to play the next 2 Sundays, right?
Yes.
Okay, and is that going to be $50?
Is that what or was it 75 on Sundays?
So 75 we paid our pianist.
Okay.
So I didn't know.
I think I promised her 75.
Okay, that's what I wondered.
Yeah.
Because I had said that about that's how much we paid the pianist.
Yeah,
So
that's.
I wasn't sure whether. All right.
Well, are there any other final thoughts on 1 Samuel?
I guess we need to read second.
I guess so. I'll make plans for it. See what happens. Usually when I say the word plan, though, that's the end of it. All right. Well, thanks.
You.
Yeah.
Have you had people online then, like watch it afterwards?
Yeah. 6 to 12, depending on. Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody. We'll be back eventually.
Eventually.
Pardon my hand.